The morning sun was just beginning to rise over London's Heathrow Airport when Camilla stepped out of her black luxury car. She was dressed elegantly in a cream-colored coat and matching hat, looking every bit the royal figure she was. Her security team surrounded her as she made her way toward the private terminal entrance. This was supposed to be a routine trip to Paris for a charity event, something she had done countless times before. The airport staff recognized her immediately and began preparing for her usual smooth passage through security. However, something was different that morning. Officer James Mitchell, a veteran Royal Guard who had been working airport security for over 15 years, noticed an unusual alert on his security tablet. There had been intelligence reports about suspicious packages being transported through private terminals, and every passenger, regardless of status, needed to go through enhanced screening procedures. James felt his stomach tighten as he realized what this meant. He would have to stop Camilla and inspect her belongings, something that had never happened before during his entire career. As Camilla approached the security checkpoint, James stepped forward with his colleague, Officer Sarah Chen. Both officers wore their formal uniforms, badges gleaming under the bright airport lights. James cleared his throat nervously and spoke in a respectful but firm tone. He explained that new security protocols required all passengers to undergo baggage inspection, including members of the royal family. Camilla stopped in her tracks, her expression shifting from surprise to mild annoyance. Her personal assistant immediately stepped forward, attempting to explain that such procedures were unnecessary for someone of her standing. The situation quickly grew tense. Other security personnel began to gather around, unsure of how to handle this delicate situation. Airport management was frantically making phone calls, trying to determine the proper protocol. Camilla's security detail looked uncomfortable, caught between following orders and protecting their charge's dignity. Meanwhile, travelers in the main terminal had started to notice the commotion in the private area. Phones were being raised and people were whispering among themselves, wondering what could possibly be happening. James maintained his professional demeanor, despite feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He had a job to do, and he knew that security protocols existed for good reason. He politely but firmly repeated his request for Camilla to place her personal bag on the inspection table. The cream-colored designer handbag she was carrying looked expensive and elegant, certainly not the type of luggage one would expect to contain anything suspicious. Yet James had learned long ago in his career never to make assumptions based on appearances. Camilla hesitated for a long moment, her jaw set in a tight line. She glanced at her assistant, then at her security team, as if looking for someone to intervene on her behalf. But James and Sarah stood their ground, knowing that any exception made today could create dangerous precedents for the future. Finally, with a heavy sigh that seemed to echo through the quiet terminal space, Camilla reached into her coat pocket and produced a small key. She placed her handbag on the stainless steel inspection table with more force than necessary, the sound reverberating in the tense silence. As James reached for a pair of inspection gloves, he noticed his hands were trembling slightly. This was unprecedented territory. He had inspected thousands of bags in his career, but never one belonging to someone so prominent. Sarah stood beside him, ready to document everything according to protocol. The security cameras above them recorded every moment, and James was acutely aware that his actions today would be scrutinized by people far above his pay grade. He took a deep breath and carefully opened the clasp on Camilla's handbag. The first items he removed were utterly ordinary. A leather wallet, a compact mirror, a tube of lipstick, a packet of tissues, and a mobile phone in an elegant case. James placed each item carefully on the table, treating them with respect despite the awkward circumstances. Camilla watched with arms crossed, her expression unreadable but her posture radiating displeasure. Her assistant was typing furiously on a phone, likely alerting palace officials about the situation. The tension in the air was so thick it felt almost suffocating. James continued his inspection, removing a small agenda book, reading glasses in a designer case, and a silk scarf folded neatly at the bottom of the bag. Everything seemed perfectly normal, exactly what one would expect to find in the personal belongings of a royal family member. He was beginning to feel foolish for causing such a scene over what appeared to be a routine inspection. Perhaps the intelligence reports had been wrong, or perhaps the suspicious activity was happening elsewhere in the airport. He was about to apologize and repack the bag when his fingers brushed against something unusual in a hidden compartment inside the handbag's lining. The compartment was cleverly concealed, almost invisible unless someone was specifically looking for it. James's training kicked in immediately. Hidden compartments were a red flag in airport security, regardless of who owned the luggage. He carefully worked his fingers into the small opening and felt something solid wrapped in fabric. His heart rate increased as he slowly extracted the object, aware that everyone around him had gone completely silent. Sarah moved closer, her hand instinctively moving toward her radio. The airport manager who had been watching from a distance took several steps forward, his face pale with worry. What James pulled from the hidden compartment made him freeze completely. Wrapped in a piece of purple velvet cloth was an object that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the security area. At first glance, it appeared to be some kind of ornate jewelry, but as he carefully unwrapped it, the true nature of the item became clear. It was a diamond and sapphire brooch, but not just any piece of jewelry. James recognized it immediately from his training materials on national treasures and protected artifacts. This brooch was part of a collection that had been reported missing from a royal vault 3 months earlier. The theft had been kept quiet to avoid public scandal, but security personnel had been briefed to watch for the missing items. Sarah gasped audibly and took a step back. The airport manager's face went from pale to completely white. Camilla's expression changed dramatically, her eyes widening in what appeared to be genuine shock. She began speaking rapidly, explaining that she had no idea the brooch was in her bag, that she hadn't placed it there, that this must be some kind of terrible mistake or misunderstanding. Her voice, usually so controlled and measured, had risen in pitch and volume. Her assistant rushed to her side, looking equally stunned and confused by this development. James's mind was racing as he tried to process what he had discovered. This was far beyond a simple security breach or protocol violation. This was potentially a major scandal involving a member of the royal family and stolen national treasures. He carefully placed the brooch on the inspection table and immediately called for his supervisor. Within minutes, additional security personnel arrived, along with representatives from Scotland Yard who had been stationed at the airport for unrelated matters. The private terminal area was quickly sealed off, and everyone present was asked to remain exactly where they were. Detective Inspector Margaret Reynolds arrived at the airport within 20 minutes of receiving the emergency call. She was a seasoned investigator who had worked on sensitive cases involving high-profile individuals before, but even she felt the weight of this situation as she walked into the sealed-off private terminal. The brooch lay on the inspection table under bright examination lights, its diamonds and sapphires catching the light and sparkling almost mockingly. Margaret approached the table slowly, her trained eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. Camilla had been moved to a private room adjacent to the security checkpoint, accompanied by her assistant and one of her security personnel. Through the glass window, Margaret could see her sitting in a leather chair, her elegant composure somewhat restored but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The detective knew this would require exceptional delicacy. She couldn't simply treat this like any other theft case. Yet she also couldn't ignore the presence of a stolen national treasure and the personal belongings of someone so prominent. The political implications alone were staggering. Margaret spent several minutes examining the brooch without touching it, noting its condition and the way it had been wrapped in the velvet cloth. She then turned her attention to the handbag itself, studying the hidden compartment where the item had been discovered. The compartment was expertly crafted, suggesting it was an original feature of the designer bag rather than something added later. This detail interested her greatly. It meant that whoever placed the brooch there knew about the compartment's existence and had access to Camilla's personal belongings. Officer James Mitchell stood nearby, looking relieved that someone with more authority had arrived to handle the situation. Margaret asked him to walk her through exactly what had happened, from the moment Camilla arrived at the airport to the discovery of the brooch. James spoke clearly and professionally, though his voice still carried traces of nervousness. Sarah Chen added her own observations, particularly noting Camilla's reaction when the brooch was revealed. Both officers agreed that the shock on her face had appeared genuine, though they acknowledged they weren't experts at reading expressions. The airport manager, a man named David Patterson, was pacing back and forth near the entrance to the secure area. He kept checking his phone, likely fielding calls from various palace officials and government representatives who were frantically trying to understand what was happening. Margaret could sympathize with his stress, but she needed to focus on the investigation. She asked David to provide her with security footage from the past 72 hours, particularly any video showing who had access to Camilla's belongings before her arrival at the airport. Margaret then made the difficult decision to formally interview Camilla. She entered the private room with a female colleague, Detective Constable Rachel Foster, who would help document the conversation. Camilla looked up as they entered, her face a careful mask of dignity despite the circumstances. Margaret introduced herself politely and explained that she needed to ask some questions about how the brooch came to be in the handbag. She emphasized that this was a preliminary interview and that Camilla was not being accused of any wrongdoing at this stage. Camilla's response was measured but clearly frustrated. She explained that the handbag had been a gift from a fashion designer during a charity event 6 months earlier. She used it regularly for travel because it was both stylish and practical, with multiple compartments for organizing her belongings. She insisted that she had never seen the stolen brooch before that morning and had no knowledge of it being in her bag. When asked about the hidden compartment, Camilla admitted she had discovered it weeks ago while looking for a place to store a spare key, but she claimed she had never placed anything valuable inside it. Margaret listened carefully, taking notes and observing Camilla's body language throughout the explanation. The story seemed plausible, but it raised more questions than it answered. Who had access to the handbag? When was the last time Camilla had thoroughly checked all its compartments? Had anyone borrowed the bag or had opportunity to place something inside without her knowledge? Camilla tried to answer each question thoughtfully, but it became clear that she couldn't account for every moment the handbag had been out of her direct possession. The questioning turned to Camilla's schedule over the past 3 months, the period since the brooch had been reported missing from the royal vault. Camilla's assistant, a efficient woman named Patricia Stone, was brought in to help provide details. Patricia produced a detailed calendar on her tablet, showing that Camilla had attended dozens of events, meetings, and functions during that time. The handbag had accompanied her to most of these occasions, though Patricia admitted that it was sometimes left in dressing rooms, coat check areas, or even in vehicles while Camilla attended certain functions. This information opened up numerous possibilities. Anyone at any of those events could potentially have accessed the handbag and planted the brooch. But why would someone do that? What would be the motive for placing a stolen national treasure in Camilla's personal belongings? Margaret considered various scenarios. Perhaps someone was trying to frame her, creating a scandal that would damage her reputation, or perhaps the brooch was being smuggled, and Camilla was an unwitting courier whose status would allow her to pass through security without inspection under normal circumstances. Margaret's colleague, Rachel, raised an important question. How did the person who planted the brooch know about the hidden compartment? This wasn't information that would be obvious to a casual observer. It suggested that whoever did this either had intimate knowledge of the handbag's design or had spent time studying it carefully. This narrowed the suspect pool considerably. It pointed toward someone in Camilla's inner circle, someone who had regular access to her belongings and opportunities to examine them closely. The detective inspector made several phone calls to Scotland Yard headquarters, briefing her superiors on the situation and requesting additional resources. A forensics team was dispatched to process the handbag and the brooch for fingerprints, DNA evidence, and any other trace materials that might provide clues. Margaret also requested background checks on everyone who had regular contact with Camilla, including her household staff, security personnel, assistants, and even frequent attendees at royal events. This would be a massive undertaking, but it was necessary. While waiting for the forensics team to arrive, Margaret reviewed the security footage that David Patterson had compiled. The videos showed Camilla arriving at various locations over the past week, always with her handbag. In most clips, the bag was either on her arm or being carried by Patricia. However, there were several instances where the bag was left unattended for brief periods. At a charity gala 3 days earlier, the handbag could be seen sitting on a chair in a dressing room while Camilla was being interviewed by reporters. At least 8 different people passed by that chair during a 15-minute period. Margaret made notes of each person who had come near the unattended handbag. She would need to identify and interview all of them. The task seemed overwhelming, but she had worked complex cases before and knew that patient, methodical investigation usually yielded results. She assigned Rachel to begin compiling a list of everyone visible in the security footage, cross-referencing them with guest lists and staff rosters from each event. As the morning stretched into afternoon, more officials arrived at the airport. Representatives from the royal household appeared, looking grim and speaking in hushed tones with legal advisors. Palace security chiefs huddled with Scotland Yard brass, discussing how to handle the public relations nightmare that would inevitably follow once news of this incident leaked. Everyone understood that it was only a matter of time before the media got wind of the story, and they needed to have their facts straight before that happened. Camilla remained in the private room, now joined by her personal lawyer, who had rushed to the airport as soon as he heard about the situation. Margaret could see through the window as animated discussions took place, with the lawyer gesturing emphatically and Camilla shaking her head frequently. The stress of the situation was evident on everyone's faces. What had started as a routine trip to Paris had transformed into a potential scandal that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. The forensics team finally arrived with their equipment cases and immediately began processing the evidence. They photographed the brooch from every angle, documenting its condition and noting the way it had been wrapped in the velvet cloth. The handbag received similar treatment with special attention paid to the hidden compartment. Fingerprint powder was carefully applied to various surfaces, and samples were collected using cotton swabs and evidence bags. The team worked with quiet efficiency, aware that their findings could be crucial to solving this mystery. Margaret watched the forensics process with interest, hoping they would find some clear evidence that would point toward the person responsible for planting the brooch. However, she knew from experience that real investigations rarely provided such convenient answers. More likely, they would find multiple sets of fingerprints belonging to people who had legitimate reasons to handle. By late afternoon, Margaret had assembled a core team of 6 investigators to work on the case. They gathered in a commandeered conference room at the airport, with whiteboards covered in photographs, timelines, and lists of potential suspects. The pressure from above to solve this case quickly was immense, but Margaret refused to rush the investigation and risk missing crucial details. She addressed her team with calm authority, outlining their approach and assigning specific tasks to each detective. The first major breakthrough came from analyzing the security footage more carefully. Detective Constable Tom Harrison, who had been reviewing hours of video, called Margaret over to his laptop with barely contained excitement. He had found something interesting at the charity gala 3 days prior. The footage showed a woman in catering staff uniform approaching the dressing room where Camilla's handbag sat unattended. The woman looked around nervously before quickly reaching into the bag, her hand disappearing inside for approximately 8 seconds before she withdrew it and hurried away. Margaret felt her pulse quicken as she watched the footage repeatedly. This was exactly the kind of evidence they needed. However, the woman's face was partially obscured by her uniform cap and the angle of the camera. They would need to enhance the image and try to identify her through other means. Tom was already working on getting a clearer image, using software to sharpen the resolution and brighten the darker areas of the video. Meanwhile, Margaret contacted the charity organization that had hosted the gala to obtain a list of all catering staff who worked that evening. While waiting for that information, Margaret returned to interview Camilla again, this time with specific questions about the charity gala. Had Camilla noticed anything unusual that evening? Did she remember leaving her handbag unattended in the dressing room? Had she interacted with any of the catering staff? Camilla thought carefully before answering, her brow furrowed in concentration. She did recall leaving the bag briefly while being interviewed, and she vaguely remembered a server offering her water. But nothing had seemed suspicious at the time. Patricia, the assistant, had more detailed memories of the evening. She remembered that the catering company was one they had worked with several times before for various royal events. They were considered reliable and trustworthy, which was why they were selected for such a high-profile function. Patricia promised to retrieve the contact information for the catering company and any records they might have about which specific employees worked the gala. This information could be cross-referenced with the security footage to identify the woman who had been seen touching Camilla's handbag. Meanwhile, Detective Constable Rachel Foster had been investigating the stolen brooch itself. She had contacted the Royal Vault security team to learn more about the circumstances of the theft 3 months earlier. The information she received was troubling. The brooch had been one of several items that went missing during a routine inventory check. Initially, the missing items were thought to be simply misplaced due to poor record keeping, but after extensive searching, it became clear they had been stolen. The theft had been kept extremely quiet to avoid embarrassing the royal household. What made this information particularly interesting was the nature of the stolen items. They weren't the most valuable pieces in the collection, which would have been kept in the highest security areas. Instead, they were moderately valuable items from a secondary vault that was accessed more frequently for loan requests to museums and special exhibitions. This suggested that the thief had inside knowledge of the vault system and deliberately chose items that might not be immediately missed. It pointed towards someone with access to the royal vaults, possibly a staff member or contractor who worked in that area. Rachel compiled a list of everyone who had access to the secondary vault during the 6-month period before the theft. The list was surprisingly long, including archivists, historians, security personnel, maintenance workers, and various royal household staff members. Cross-referencing this list with people who had been present at the charity gala would be a massive task, but it was necessary. Rachel began the painstaking work of checking names and looking for any overlaps. Back at the airport, the forensics results were beginning to come in. As Margaret had suspected, the handbag yielded multiple fingerprints belonging to Camilla, Patricia, and several security personnel who regularly handled her belongings. However, there was one partial print on the inside of the hidden compartment that didn't match anyone in Camilla's immediate circle. This print was being run through various databases to see if it matched any known criminals or individuals with access to royal properties. The velvet cloth wrapping the brooch also contained some fiber, evidence that the forensics team was analyzing. Tom Harrison finally managed to enhance the security footage enough to get a clearer image of the woman in the catering uniform. Margaret studied the enhanced photo carefully. The woman appeared to be in her 30s with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. There was something familiar about her face, though Margaret couldn't immediately place where she might have seen her before. She distributed copies of the enhanced image to all team members and requested they show it to everyone they interviewed, hoping someone might recognize her. The catering company records arrived via email, and Patricia helped identify which employees had worked the charity gala. There were 12 catering staff members present that evening, including servers, bartenders, and kitchen personnel. Tom began the process of contacting each one for interviews. Most were cooperative and agreed to come in for questioning, though a few had moved on to other jobs or were difficult to reach. One name on the list stood out immediately when Margaret saw it: Sophie Whitmore, who was listed as a temporary server hired specifically for that one event. Something about a temporary hire for such a high-security event raised red flags for Margaret. She asked Patricia if temporary staff were normally used at royal functions, and Patricia confirmed that while it wasn't unusual during busy seasons, there was supposed to be thorough vetting of anyone working near royal family members. Margaret requested Sophie Whitmore's employment file from the catering company, along with copies of her background check and references. The catering company manager seemed confused by the request, but promised to send everything they had on file. When Sophie Whitmore's file arrived, Margaret's instincts proved correct. The background check had been cursory at best, consisting mainly of a simple criminal record search that came back clean. The references provided were from 2 previous employers, but when Rachel called to verify them, one number was disconnected and the other belonged to a business that had closed down 6 months earlier. The address listed for Sophie on her employment application led to a short-term rental property that she had vacated weeks ago. Everything about Sophie Whitmore's identity seemed designed to disappear after a short time. Margaret asked Tom to compare the enhanced photo of the woman from the security footage with Sophie Whitmore's employee photo on file with the catering company. Even accounting for differences in lighting and angles, there appeared to be significant similarities. The shape of the face, the dark hair, the approximate age all matched. This was almost certainly the same person. Now they just needed to find out where Sophie Whitmore had gone and whether that was even her real name. A database search for Sophie Whitmore produced several results, but none matched the woman they were looking for. The name appeared to be an alias, which suggested a level of planning and sophistication that went beyond a simple opportunistic theft. This was someone who had deliberately positioned herself to have access to Camilla's belongings at the charity gala. But was she working alone, or was she part of a larger operation? And most importantly, why plant the stolen brooch in Camilla's handbag instead of simply keeping it or selling it? Margaret gathered her team again to discuss these questions. Several theories emerged during their brainstorming session. One possibility was that Sophie was part of a theft ring that had stolen the brooch from the royal vault months earlier and was now trying to smuggle it out of the country by hiding it in the belongings of someone who would normally pass through security without inspection. Another theory suggested that Sophie might be trying to frame Camilla for the theft, perhaps as revenge for some perceived slight or as part of a larger political scheme. Detective Constable James Chen, who had been quiet during most of the meeting, raised a third possibility that made everyone pause. What if Sophie had been hired by someone else to plant the brooch? Perhaps the real criminal mastermind was someone closer to Camilla, someone who wanted to create a scandal or divert attention from their own activities. This theory made disturbing sense, especially given the sophisticated nature of the operation and the insider knowledge that would be required. Margaret decided they needed to look more closely at everyone in Camilla's inner circle. Despite the sensitivity of such an investigation, this would include household staff, security personnel, and even people she considered friends and trusted advisors. Rachel was tasked with discreetly investigating financial records to see if anyone had recently received large, unexplained payments or was experiencing money troubles. The investigation took a dramatic turn the following morning when Rachel Foster discovered something shocking in the financial records. Edward Collins, one of Camilla's longtime security personnel who had been with her for nearly 8 years, had received 3 separate wire transfers totaling £50,000 over the past 2 months. The transfers came from an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands, which raised immediate suspicions. When Rachel dug deeper, she found that Edward had also been accumulating significant gambling debts at several London casinos over the past year. Margaret felt her stomach sink as she reviewed the evidence. Edward Collins had been present at virtually every event Camilla attended, including the charity gala where Sophie Whitmore had been seen tampering with the handbag. He would have had countless opportunities to provide information about Camilla's schedule, her habits, and details like the hidden compartment in her handbag. The pieces were starting to fit together in a disturbing pattern. Margaret knew they needed to bring Edward in for questioning immediately, but they would have to be careful not to alert him before they were ready. She coordinated with Scotland Yard to arrange Edward's detention in a way that wouldn't cause alarm. He was called to headquarters under the pretense of providing a witness statement about general security procedures at royal events. Edward arrived at the appointed time, looking professional in his dark suit and showing no signs of nervousness. He was shown to an interview room where Margaret and Tom Harrison were waiting. The casual atmosphere changed quickly when Margaret informed him that he was being questioned as a suspect rather than a witness. Edward's composure cracked almost immediately. His face went pale and his hands began to tremble as he gripped the edge of the table. Margaret laid out what they knew about the financial transfers, the gambling debts, and his opportunity to provide inside information. She gave him a chance to explain himself before the evidence made his situation even worse. For several long minutes, Edward sat in silence, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, with his voice barely above a whisper, he began to talk. The story that emerged was both sad and infuriating. Edward admitted that his gambling addiction had spiraled out of control over the past year. He had borrowed money from the wrong people, dangerous people who didn't accept excuses for late payments. When he couldn't pay, they offered him an alternative. They wanted information about royal security procedures, schedules, and personal habits of family members. At first, Edward provided only minor details, things he convinced himself wouldn't really matter. But the demands escalated, and the payments increased along with his debts. 3 months ago, Edward was told about a plan to steal items from the royal vault. He wasn't directly involved in the theft itself, but he provided crucial information about security shift changes and blind spots in the camera coverage. After the theft, he thought his involvement was over. He had been paid enough to clear his immediate debts, and he promised himself he would never get involved in anything criminal again. But then the mysterious people contacted him again with a new request. one that would prove to be far more serious. They told Edward about their plan to use Camilla as an unwitting courier to smuggle the stolen brooch out of the country. Edward's role was to provide detailed information about her travel schedule and the specific handbag she would be carrying. He was also supposed to ensure that Sophie Whitmore, their agent, would have access to the charity gala. Edward used his position to add her name to the approved catering staff list, bypassing the usual thorough background checks by indicating she had already been vetted for previous royal events. Margaret listened to Edward's confession with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal disappointment. Here was a man who had served faithfully for years, but had let his personal demons destroy his integrity and potentially harm someone he was sworn to protect. She pressed him for information about the people who had recruited him. Who were they? How did they contact him? Where was the stolen brooch supposed to end up after Camilla carried it through airport security? Edward's answers were frustratingly vague. He had only ever dealt with 2 people, both of whom used obvious aliases. His main contact was a man who called himself Mr. Black, a sophisticated individual in his 50s who spoke with a faint European accent that Edward couldn't quite place. Mr. Black had an encyclopedic knowledge of royal procedures and security systems, suggesting he had either worked in such environments before or had extensively researched them. The second person was Sophie Whitmore, though Edward admitted that was probably not her real name either. The plan, as Edward understood it, was elegant in its simplicity. The stolen brooch would be planted in Camilla's handbag in a hidden compartment. When she traveled to Paris, she would pass through the private terminal where security checks were minimal for royal family members. Once in France, another member of the criminal network would retrieve the brooch from her belongings, probably during one of her scheduled events where her handbag might be briefly unattended. Camilla would never know she had been used as a smuggling courier, and the theft would remain unsolved with the trail going cold. What the criminals hadn't anticipated was the enhanced security protocols that were implemented at all airports, including private terminals just days before Camilla's scheduled trip. These new measures were a response to general security concerns and had nothing to do with the brooch theft. The timing was pure coincidence, but it had exposed the entire smuggling operation. Edward claimed he had tried to warn his contacts about the new security measures, but they either didn't receive his message in time or chose to proceed anyway, perhaps thinking Camilla's status would still allow her to skip the enhanced screening. Margaret asked about the other stolen items from the royal vault. Where were they now? Edward believed they had already been smuggled out of the country using similar methods, possibly through other unwitting couriers or through more conventional smuggling routes. The brooch had been saved for last because it was the most valuable and recognizable of the stolen items, requiring extra care in its transportation. Edward didn't know where the items were ultimately destined, but he suspected they were heading to wealthy private collectors who didn't care about the illegal provenance of their acquisitions. With Edward's cooperation secured, Margaret now faced the challenge of tracking down Mr. Black and Sophie Whitmore before they disappeared completely. Edward provided phone numbers he had used to contact them, though Margaret suspected these would lead to untraceable burner phones. He also described the few face-to-face meetings he had with Mr. Black, which always took place in crowded public locations like busy cafes or train stations, where surveillance would be difficult. The criminal network had been very careful about protecting their identities and maintaining operational security. Tom Harrison was assigned to work with telecommunications experts to trace the phone numbers in any electronic communications between Edward and his criminal contacts. Meanwhile, Rachel Foster coordinated with Interpol to search international databases for known art thieves and smugglers who might match Mr. Black's description. The European accent suggested someone with continental connections, possibly part of one of the organized networks that specialized in high-value art and artifact theft. Margaret returned to the airport to update Camilla on the progress of the investigation. The revelation that someone on her own security team had betrayed her was devastating. Camilla listened to the explanation in stunned silence, her usual composure completely shattered. She had trusted Edward Collins, relied on him to keep her safe, and now she learned he had actively facilitated a criminal plot that used her as an unwitting accomplice. The betrayal was deeply personal, and Margaret could see the hurt in her eyes. Even as she struggled to maintain her dignity, the immediate question was what to do about Camilla's interrupted trip to Paris. The charity event she was supposed to attend was important, and many people were depending on her appearance. However, the investigation was ongoing, and there was still a risk that other members of the criminal network might try to make contact or create new problems. After consultation with Scotland Yard and Palace Security, it was decided that Camilla should postpone her trip until the investigation reached a more conclusive stage. As Margaret left the airport that evening, she felt the weight of the case settling heavily on her shoulders. They had made significant progress in understanding how the smuggling operation worked, and Edward's confession had provided crucial insights. However, the main perpetrators were still at large, and there was no guarantee they would be able to track them down before they vanished into the criminal underworld. The next few days would be critical in determining whether they could bring the entire network to justice, or whether Mr. Black and Sophie Whitmore would remain frustratingly out of reach. Back at Scotland Yard, the team worked late into the night analyzing all the information they had gathered. Tom had made progress tracing the phone numbers, which led to a series of burner phones purchased at different locations around London. While the phones themselves were untraceable, the purchase locations provided geographical data that might help narrow down. Margaret received an unexpected breakthrough 48 hours after Edward's confession. A detective from the Paris Police Department contacted her with information about Sophia Mercier. French authorities had been monitoring known associates of art theft networks, and Sophia's name had appeared in surveillance reports from an upscale hotel in the Marais district just 3 days earlier. She had been seen meeting with an unidentified, older man who matched the general description of Mr. Black. The French detective offered to coordinate with Scotland Yard to try to locate and apprehend both suspects. Within hours, Margaret was on a flight to Paris with Tom Harrison. They met with Detective Claude Rousseau, a veteran investigator with the Brigade de Répression du Banditisme, who specialized in art crime. Claude had assembled a small team of trusted officers who understood the sensitive nature of the case. They gathered in an unmarked office near the Bastille, where Claude laid out what his team had discovered through their surveillance operations. The hotel where Sophia had been spotted catering to wealthy international clientele, the type of establishment where people paid premium prices for privacy and discretion. The staff were trained not to ask questions or share information about guests. However, Claude's team had cultivated a source within the hotel, a night manager who was cooperative with police in exchange for overlooking certain minor infractions. This manager confirmed that a man matching Mr. Black's description had been staying in a suite under the name Victor Petrov for the past 2 weeks. Margaret felt a surge of adrenaline. They finally had a solid lead on one of the main architects of the smuggling operation. Claude explained that they had been watching the hotel discreetly, documenting everyone who entered or left Victor Petrov's suite. Sophia Mercier had visited twice, and several other individuals had also made brief visits. Photographs from the surveillance showed Victor Petrov to be a distinguished-looking man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed and moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to operating in elite circles. The challenge now was determining the best approach to apprehend the suspects without alerting them or compromising the investigation. Claude suggested they could arrest Victor Petrov at the hotel, but Margaret worried that Sophia and other network members might flee if they learned of his detention. After lengthy discussion, they developed a plan to monitor the hotel intensively and wait for an opportunity to catch both suspects together, ideally with evidence that would tie them directly to the theft and smuggling operation. Their patience was rewarded sooner than expected. Late that evening, surveillance teams reported that Sophia Mercier had entered the hotel and gone directly to Victor Petrov's suite. Phone intercepts obtained through proper legal channels indicated they were planning to leave Paris the following morning. This was their window of opportunity. Margaret and Claude coordinated with tactical teams to prepare for simultaneous arrests. They would move at dawn, when the suspects would likely be less alert and before they could make their planned departure. The operation began at 5 in the morning. Armed police officers quietly secured the hotel exits while Margaret, Tom, Claude, and several other detectives made their way to the 5th floor, where Victor Petrov's suite was located. The hallway was silent except for the soft footfalls of the officers moving into position. Margaret felt her heart pounding as they approached the door. This was the culmination of days of intensive investigation, and they couldn't afford any mistakes. Claude knocked firmly on the door and announced their presence in both French and English. There was a long moment of silence, then the sound of movement inside the suite. The door opened to reveal Viktor Petrov, dressed in an elegant silk robe and looking remarkably calm despite the early morning police presence. His eyes scanned the officers with sharp intelligence, and Margaret could see him rapidly assessing the situation and his options. Behind him, Sophia Mercier appeared in the doorway to the bedroom, her face showing genuine alarm. The arrests proceeded smoothly, with both suspects offered no physical resistance. As they were read their rights, Margaret and her team began searching the suite. What they found exceeded their expectations. Viktor Petrov had been careless, perhaps overconfident in his ability to operate undetected. In a safe hidden behind a painting in the bedroom, investigators discovered documentation relating to the theft of multiple items from various European royal collections over the past 3 years. There were photographs of artifacts, detailed notes about security systems, and a ledger listing sales to private collectors. Most significantly, they found a laptop computer that contained encrypted files related to the operation against Camilla. The files included Edward Collins's contact information, detailed schedules of Camilla's movements, photographs of her handbag from various angles, and communications planning the smuggling operation. There were also messages discussing the failure of the airport smuggling attempt and contingency plans to retrieve the brooch through other means. This evidence would be crucial in prosecuting not just the theft charges, but also conspiracy and attempted smuggling. Viktor Petrov remained silent during the initial processing, refusing to answer any questions without his lawyer present. However, Sophia Mercier proved more talkative, perhaps hoping to negotiate a favorable deal in exchange for cooperation. She confirmed that Viktor was the mastermind behind multiple art theft operations across Europe. She had been working for him for nearly 5 years, using her skills in identity fraud to gain access to high-security locations. The operation targeting Camilla had been Viktor's most ambitious plan, combining theft from a royal vault with an elaborate smuggling scheme. According to Sophia's statement, Viktor had connections with several wealthy collectors in Russia and the Middle East who were willing to pay enormous sums for rare artifacts, no questions asked. The items stolen from the royal vault were already promised to specific buyers before they were even taken. The brooch was destined for a Russian oligarch who collected pieces with royal provenance. The smuggling plan using Camilla as an unwitting courier had been Viktor's idea, designed to be both audacious and virtually impossible to detect under normal circumstances. Margaret pressed Sophia for information about the other stolen items from the royal vault. Where were they now? Had they already been sold and delivered to their buyers? Sophia claimed that 2 of the stolen pieces had indeed been smuggled out of Britain and delivered to collectors, but 3 others, including a diamond tiara and an antique snuff box, were still in London awaiting transport. She agreed to provide their location in exchange for consideration during sentencing. The items were being held in a storage facility in East London, registered under yet another false identity. The recovery operation for the remaining stolen items was executed that same afternoon. British and French authorities coordinated to simultaneously secure the storage facility in London while maintaining custody of Viktor and Sophia in Paris. The storage unit contained exactly what Sophia had described, carefully packed and ready for shipment. The recovery of these pieces, combined with the brooch that had been found in Camilla's handbag, meant that most of the stolen items had been successfully retrieved. Efforts would continue to track down the 2 pieces that had already been sold, though Margaret knew that recovering items from private collectors could take months or even years. Back in London, Edward Collins formally pled guilty to conspiracy and providing confidential information to criminal networks. His cooperation with the investigation was noted, but he still faced significant prison time for his role in the thefts. During his sentencing hearing, Edward expressed deep remorse for his actions and the betrayal of trust. He spoke about how his gambling addiction had destroyed his judgment and led him to make terrible choices. While his apology was genuine, it couldn't undo the damage he had caused to the institution he had sworn to protect. The case generated enormous media attention once the arrests were announced. Headlines around the world covered the story of the attempted smuggling operation, using a royal family member as an unwitting courier. However, palace officials worked carefully to manage the narrative, emphasizing that Camilla had been completely unaware of the plot and was in fact a victim of the criminal conspiracy. The focus shifted toward the sophisticated nature of the international theft ring and the excellent police work that had uncovered and dismantled it. Margaret and her team received commendations for their work on the case. The investigation had been complex and politically sensitive, requiring both technical skill and diplomatic finesse. Margaret was particularly proud of how her team had followed the evidence methodically, while maintaining absolute professionalism throughout the process. The case would serve as a model for future investigations, involving high-profile individuals and sophisticated criminal networks. Claude Rousseau and the French police also received recognition for their crucial role in locating and apprehending Victor Petrov and Sophia Mercier. The international cooperation between law enforcement agencies had been essential to the successful outcome. Claude told Margaret during their final meeting in Paris that this case had helped strengthen relationships between British and French authorities, which would benefit future. 3 months after the trial concluded, life gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy for everyone involved in the case. Camilla resumed her public duties, though she carried with her a heightened awareness of security concerns and a certain wariness that hadn't been present before. The incident had been a profound reminder that even those in positions of privilege and protection were vulnerable to sophisticated criminal operations. She worked closely with her new security team to implement comprehensive changes in how her belongings were monitored and how background checks were conducted on staff members. Margaret Reynolds found herself somewhat of a celebrity within law enforcement circles. She had been promoted to Detective Chief Inspector and was now leading a specialized unit focused on art crime and heritage theft. The unit had been established partially as a result of the high-profile case, with government officials recognizing the need for dedicated expertise in this area. Margaret assembled a team of investigators with diverse backgrounds, including art historians, financial analysts, and technology specialists who could tackle the increasingly sophisticated methods used by international theft networks. The royal household conducted an extensive internal review of their security procedures following the breach. The audit revealed several weaknesses that Victor Petrov's network had exploited. Access to sensitive areas had been granted too readily based on long-term employment, rather than continuous vetting. Financial monitoring of security personnel had been inadequate, failing to detect Edward Collins's mounting debts until it was too late. The review resulted in a complete overhaul of security protocols, including regular financial disclosure requirements for anyone with access to royal family members or valuable collections. Officer James Mitchell, the airport security guard who had initially stopped Camilla and discovered the brooch, received recognition for his adherence to protocol despite the uncomfortable circumstances. He was awarded a commendation for professionalism and courage in doing his duty regardless of the status of the individual involved. James remained humble about his role, insisting he had simply been following proper procedures. However, his actions had been instrumental in exposing a major criminal operation, and his story became part of training materials for security personnel across the country. The recovered artifacts from the royal vault were restored to their proper places, with enhanced security measures implemented to prevent future thefts. Museum curators and security experts worked together to redesign the storage and access systems for the collection. Advanced technology, including biometric locks, motion sensors, and improved camera coverage were installed. The secondary vault where the original theft occurred was completely renovated, with access now restricted to a much smaller number of rigorously vetted personnel. Patricia Stone, Camilla's assistant, also underwent a period of reflection and adjustment after the case. She had worked closely with Edward Collins for years and felt guilty for not noticing the signs of his financial distress and the compromised security. Patricia became an advocate within the royal household for better support systems for staff members, arguing that providing confidential counseling and financial advice services might prevent future cases of personnel being vulnerable to external pressure and manipulation. The case had broader implications for security practices beyond the royal household. Museums, art galleries, and cultural institutions across Europe reviewed their own procedures in light of what had happened. International cooperation between law enforcement agencies was strengthened, with better information sharing about known art thieves and suspicious activities. Viktor Petrov's network had operated successfully for years by exploiting gaps in communication between different jurisdictions, and authorities were determined not to let similar networks operate so freely in the future. Tom Harrison and Rachel Foster, who had worked alongside Margaret throughout the investigation, both received promotions and joined her new specialized unit. The three of them formed the core of a team that would go on to investigate several other significant art theft cases over the following years. Their experience with the Royal Vault case gave them insights into how sophisticated criminals operated and how to build cases against networks that often spanned multiple countries. For Edward Collins, life in prison was a harsh adjustment after years of working in prestigious positions with the royal household. He participated in addiction counseling programs and expressed a genuine desire to understand and overcome the gambling problem that had led to his downfall. Edward wrote letters to Camilla and other members of the royal household apologizing for his betrayal, though he received no responses. He understood that some breaches of trust could never be fully repaired, regardless of remorse or rehabilitation. Sophia Mercier adapted to prison life with the pragmatism of someone who had always been a survivor. She used her time to study art history and languages, skills that she ironically might have developed legitimately had she chosen a different path in life. Sophia maintained that she had been primarily motivated by money, rather than any particular malice toward the people she had helped rob. This rationalization offered her little comfort during the long years of incarceration ahead. Viktor Petrov remained largely unrepentant, viewing his conviction as simply an occupational hazard of his chosen profession. He refused most interview requests from law enforcement and researchers wanting to understand his methods. However, through careful analysis of his seized documents and communications, investigators were able to map out a significant portion of his criminal network. This led to additional arrests of dealers, collectors, and facilitators who had been part of his operations over the years. The two artifacts that had been sold before the smuggling operation was disrupted proved difficult to recover. One piece was eventually located in the possession of a collector in Dubai, who claimed to have purchased it in good faith through a legitimate dealer. Legal proceedings to recover the item were complicated by jurisdictional issues and questions about the collector's knowledge of the artifact's stolen status. After 2 years of negotiation, a settlement was reached where the collector returned the piece in exchange for compensation equal to what he had paid. The second missing item, an ornate ceremonial sword, remained elusive despite extensive efforts to locate it. Intelligence suggested it had been sold to a private collector in Russia, but Russian authorities were unable or unwilling to pursue the matter aggressively. The sword was listed in international databases of stolen artifacts, and there remained hope that it might someday surface and be recovered. Such was often the case with stolen art and historical objects, existing in a shadowy world where patience and persistence were required for eventual recovery. Camilla eventually made her rescheduled trip to Paris, 6 months after the original planned journey. The charity event she attended was a significant success, raising substantial funds for causes she supported. When she passed through airport security this time, she did so without incident, though she couldn't help but think about the dramatic events that had unfolded during her previous attempt to travel. The experience had changed her perspective on security and the various people whose work usually went unnoticed in protecting public figures. The media interest in the case gradually faded as other news stories captured public attention. However, the incident remained a topic of discussion in security and law enforcement circles for years afterward. It was studied as a case example of how sophisticated criminals could exploit trust and access, and how important it was to maintain vigilant procedures even for individuals who seemed above suspicion. The case also highlighted the value of international cooperation in tackling crimes that crossed national borders. Margaret occasionally reflected on the case during quiet moments in her office. It had been one of the most challenging investigations of her career, requiring a delicate balance between thoroughness and sensitivity. The successful outcome had validated her methodical approach and her insistence on following evidence wherever it led, regardless of political pressures or uncomfortable implications. She kept a photograph from the case on her desk, not of any of the suspects or evidence, but of the recovered artifacts laid out in the royal vault after their return. It reminded her why the work mattered beyond just solving crimes or catching criminals. Years later, when Margaret gave lectures at police academies and security conferences, she would often use the case as an illustration of several important principles. First, that no one should be above security procedures regardless of their status or position. James Mitchell's adherence to protocol had been vindicated by the discovery of the smuggled brooch. Second, that criminal networks often succeeded by exploiting human weaknesses like addiction and financial desperation, making it important to provide support systems that might prevent people from becoming vulnerable to recruitment. Third, Margaret emphasized the critical importance of international cooperation in modern law enforcement. The case had been solved through the collaborative efforts of British and French police, along with assistance from authorities in several other countries. In an increasingly connected world where criminals could operate across borders with relative ease,